Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Substance Misuse and Traumatic Grief. And we're delighted to be joined today by our expert speaker, Lorna Templeton, whose presentation at this event is going to be titled Supporting Families Affected by Another's Drug and Alcohol Problem and Those Bereaved Through Substance Use. And Lorna is going to be speaking for around an hour or so, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her. And throughout Lorna's presentation, she's going to be providing an opportunity for any questions to be asked. And if anyone from the audience would have any questions, it would be great if they could use the box that's on the side of your screen on the GoToWebinar software, which should provide an option for you to put in any questions and send those over to me, and then I can then go and pass those on to Lorna, and hopefully she can answer any queries that you might have. And yes, speaking today, I'm just going to begin the webinar. I'm going to provide a brief overview of break support services and our work in supporting suddenly bereaved people. And this will then be followed by an extensive input session from Lorna. And Lorna, just as a bit of introduction and as way of background, she's got over 15 years experience of research in the fields of addiction and mental health. She's currently a visiting fellow at the University of Bath, and prior to this position, she's worked in research capacities at a really wide variety of organisations, and these include the National Addiction Centre in London, and also 13 years of experience at the Bath Mental Health Research and Development Unit. And just to begin the presentation, a bit of a sort of background and overview of Break and our services. We're a road safety charity. We've got two main aims, which are to prevent road crashes and to support the victims of road crashes. And we were founded in 1995. We work extensively with communities and organisations across the UK, aiming to stop the tragedy of road deaths and injuries and to make streets and communities safer for everyone. And for our work at Break, particularly for our support services, we're very aware of the sort of complex relationship between substance misuse and bereavement. And in particular, through the helpline, whose services I will overview a little bit further in my presentation, we know that tragically sudden bereavement can often result in substance and alcohol use from bereaved people afterwards. And we know that this is a very important issue, and we really do hope that the information that's included in Lorna's presentation today provide some really useful context and background for all of you in the audience today. And also for our Southern Initiative and other work, we're aware of the sort of challenging impact that bereavement through substance misuse can have on people, and it is absolutely vital and essential that individuals have the right support available and in place. And just on the screen now, we've got a couple of the other projects that Break run. These include Road Safety Week, which is actually coming up pretty soon. It's in about 2 or 3 weeks, and it's running from November 21st to 27th this year. If anyone would like any more information about how you can get involved, this can be found at www.roadsafetyweek.org.uk or just through the main Break website. And another key initiative that we run is our Sudden Project. This is a charitable initiative developed and run by Break, and it's been founded following the extensive experience that we've developed of delivering support services for people who've been bereaved by road crashes, which are tragically one of the main causes of sudden death, and also our expertise in providing professional development services for carers of people who've been bereaved by road crashes. And through Sudden, we share best practice, research and resources among professionals across the world who are working with people who've been suddenly bereaved by any cause. And just on the screen here, we've got a couple of our upcoming events this year. As we're getting quite late into the year, we've actually only got one more event after this one coming up, and that's our Supporting Suddenly Bereaved Families Seminar, which is going to be held in Edinburgh in Scotland on the 6th of December 2016. And if anyone would like any more information about this event or the speakers we've got at it, please feel free to visit our website at www.sudden.org or drop me an email after this webinar. And our 2017 dates are just currently being confirmed at the moment, but do watch this space and we'll be in touch with details of these once they have been confirmed and finalised. So just to begin the webinar with a bit of information about Break, I'm just going to provide a quick overview of our support services and the services that we can provide to people who've been suddenly bereaved. And as some of you may well be aware, Break is a charity that primarily supports the victims of road crashes. And on the screen here, we've got a picture of some of Break's support services team. We're quite a small team. There's only about 8 of us in the service, but there are many roles, and this varies from our helpline officers to the work we carry out with the police and emergency services, resource provision, and also events that we run. The main aim of Break support services is to support people and to enable them to move forward following a sudden bereavement. We provide emotional support, advocacy and research with the aim of helping people overcome and understand unfamiliar and uncomplicated procedures and to hopefully move on forward positively following this sudden bereavement. And our helpline team are able to offer advocacy and research and also help to identify perhaps more serious and severe physical or mental conditions and signpost these people to the relevant organisations that can be of assistance to them. There are 3 key ways in which BREAK tries to ensure that people who have been suddenly bereaved receive the help and support that they need. And these are through our literature and online resources, which includes our recorded and downloadable copies of our bereavement guides, and also our guidance materials and events reports. Also through our services run by our specialist helpline, which is a service that's available both for people who've been bereaved or seriously injured in road crashes, but also professionals, particularly including police family liaison officers, who are able to support by providing research, advice and advocacy, and also for our Sun initiative and the events and training development opportunities that we run for professionals. The BREAK's support literature. There's a wide range of support literature that we offer. It's written by experts and reviewed by experts as well, and it's all aimed to be written in a clear and very accessible style. And our bereavement support packs contains information and answers to stuff that we find is often very common in people who have been suddenly bereaved about the practical and procedural issues that come following a sudden death. And also they include information about emotional support and guidance as well. And the main channel for this distribution is through the police, and the literature is generally distributed within around 24 hours of a death. Now, bereavement packs, they're updated and revised annually, and a full consultation on these takes place on a 3-year rolling schedule. And our bereavement packs actually include specific versions for England and Wales, Northern Ireland, and also Scotland as well. And these are all updated to ensure that they're specifically done, that they accurately represent the legislative and procedural differences in all of these countries. And alongside our bereavement packs, another key resource that we produce is our Coping with Grief booklet. And this text contains sections on the common feelings and emotions that people who have tragically been suddenly bereaved often experience and may go through. And it also includes reassurance and tips about how they can help themselves get through each day, and also signposting to other organisations that can be of help and support. And this booklet and also our bereavement pack are all available free of charge. They're available to be downloaded as PDFs from both the BREAK and the Sun website, and physical copies can also be ordered from the BREAK online shop. Now, Amy and Tom books are another resource that we've put together and these have the aim of supporting suddenly bereaved children. And they're designed for children and their adult carers, whether that's their parents or another family member or another support worker, to be able to read together. And we produce 2 versions of these books. There's a book titled Someone Has Died Suddenly, which is a more sort of general, generic book, and there's also a slightly more specified Someone Has Died in a Road Crash version that includes information that's specific to someone who's tragically been bereaved for a road crash. And the road crash specific version is free of charge to order for any child who's been bereaved for a road crash. And there is a small charge attached to orders of the general book, but reductions are available for any bulk orders. The BREAK helpline, it's a free phone service. The number is there on the screens, and you can also get in touch with the helpline through our email address, which is helpline@break.org.uk. It's fully equality accredited now by the helpline standard, and we try to ensure that all support offered through the helpline is delivered professionally to the highest of levels. And alongside our own experiences and skills through the helpline team, we do aim, where it's possible, to work in partnership alongside other agencies, organisations and other support services to make sure that we can increase the range and availability of the support we can offer and to maximise our sort of own internal knowledge. We've currently got 5 part-time members on our helpline, and it's available for anyone in the UK who's been bereaved or seriously injured in a road crash. And through this service, we can also support friends and family members of someone who's been bereaved or seriously injured, but also professionals, particularly, as mentioned before, police family liaison officers or other support workers. And there's no time limit for when people can call or the number of calls, or also how long the call can last. And we'll support people in the world no matter where it occurred, the crash. And through this, we work in partnership quite extensively with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to ensure that people who are tragically bereaved abroad are supported properly. But unfortunately, due to funding and capacity issues, we are unable to support drivers who caused the crash, witnesses, or under 16s, although our helpline service is able to signpost people towards other organisations that may be able to provide support for these groups. And so just a bit of information here on this slide about why Break provides this service. And a study from the Federation of European Road Crash Victims in 1993 tragically found that 90% of families who are bereaved by road crashes experienced a permanent decline in their quality of life. And the study also found that nearly 60% of those who are bereaved suffered from subsequent health problems, particularly difficulty sleeping and depression. These are very common issues that we tend to find. And sadly, a follow-up study in 1995 identified that over 90% of people who are bereaved in road crashes reported an inability to take pleasure in life. And so what we want to do for our helpline is to ensure that people are offered the right support, and that after time and with this support, they're able to move forward positively and offer the correct care. And we're very aware of the complex and widespread impacts that sudden bereavement can cause, and we try to ensure that we can work with other agencies and as many partners as are necessary to ensure that people are offered the support that they require. Our helpline offers a very broad range of services. This ranges from our helpline officers, who are a dedicated team, to also our I've Been There service, which pairs Break bereaved volunteers with a Break helpline caller who's perhaps going through a similar experience to them. And what this does in a very nice way is it's able to offer someone who's been through a similar experience and has now moved forward from this in a more sort of positive way to someone who's perhaps a little bit earlier in their grief journey, so that people can discuss with each other and they're able to perhaps understand where someone else is coming from on their journey. And our helpline, it's there to provide a trusted place for people to turn to talk about their feelings and relationships and any other issues that they might be facing. And our officers have a very strong sort of background in legal knowledge and legal matters, and we're able to provide advice and guidance on criminal justice procedures, and also things such as police investigations and inquests that can seem quite complicated, particularly in the aftermath of a sudden bereavement. And from our many years of supporting callers, we've developed excellent knowledge in all manner of areas of practical help. And we're also able, as mentioned, to signpost and refer people who have been bereaved to other forms of support. And whilst Break isn't able to offer face-to-face support, what we can do is use our extensive database of low-cost therapy and counselling to make sure that people are able to receive the face-to-face support that they may require. And we're also able to work alongside other medical groups and other organisations such as Road Peace, who offer specialist group support. And we can also make calls to services and authorities on callers' behalf, sort of to act as a middleman almost, to assist with any issue that's causing them difficulty. And this can be particularly helpful if there are cases where perhaps relationships are broken down between authorities and the helpline caller. And here on the screen are just a couple of practical ways in which we've been able to help some of our helpline callers. And these include quite often undertaking funding applications, and these are sometimes things as small and as simple as ensuring that a helpline caller is able to use their mobile phone, or just things such as getting helping hand pots that offer helpline callers who might be experiencing financial hardship to be able to eat well or to visit a family member. And we also work extensively with agencies, particularly such as the Centre for Domestic Violence, and we have excellent relationships with police forces up and down the country. And we can arrange for helpline callers who've been identified as being either vulnerable or high risk to receive perhaps more specialist therapy, such as suicide prevention respite stay. And our tailored support services through the helpline tries to ensure that we identify each individual unique need from each caller. And as mentioned previously, our I've Been There service is a service that's sort of facilitated between a helpline caller and a Break bereaved volunteer. And it's monitored by a Break helpline officer, and they remain on the line as a silent partner, but they're available to offer any support or intervention if this is required. And it offers a great opportunity for a helpline caller to talk with someone who's perhaps experienced a similar trauma, but's been able to move on from it positively. And here on the screen, we've just got a couple of comments and feedback from people who have called into the helpline. And this is a service that it's getting busier year on year. And the figures from last year in 2015 actually revealed that we supported an estimated around just under 600 cases. And the amount of this contact, it does vary from case to case. Some callers might only call once, and in other cases, the contact might be more prolonged and extended. Some callers we find might call on the day after a crash has occurred and they've been informed by a family liaison officer. And sometimes we don't actually hear contact from a helpline caller until perhaps weeks, months or years after the death or serious injury has occurred. And since 2012, we've actually seen a near 50% increase in the cases and just under 90% rise in the number of calls and emails to victims and professionals supporting victims that we're working with. And if you would like to access any of the reports, guidance, or other materials that have been mentioned throughout this presentation, many of these are either available on the Break website, where the link you should be able to see at the bottom of the screen, or also through our Sudden Project website, which can be reached at www.sudden.org. So thanks very much to everyone for listening to that, and I'll now hopefully be able to hand over to our main speaker, Lorna Templeton. Hi, Lorna.
Hi.
Can you hear us okay?
Yep.
Perfect.
I can still. Can you see my slide?
I'm going to hand over to you now, so that should mean that everyone can see your screen.
Okay.
There we go, perfect. And I'll mute myself.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Jack. As Jack said, I've been working in the field of addiction and families for around 20 years. I've been working on a freelance basis for about 6 years now. I'm a trustee of 2 organisations in the field, one here in the UK and one is an international organisation, but based in, here in the UK. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining the seminar. This afternoon. It's great to have so much interest and from a diverse audience too. So I hope that there'll be something for you all in what I'm going to talk about over the course of the next hour or so. I understand from those who signed up that there may well be people who've kind of joined us from outside of the UK. So a big kind of welcome to you as well. This is the first time I've done a webinar, so I do hope that it's going to go okay. In being self-employed, I work from home in Bristol in the southwest of England, so I'm sitting in my study here at home. It does feel a little weird to be sitting here and talking to myself, but hopefully it's all going to be okay and there's not going to be any technical hitches and so on. There are going to be 3 main sections to what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. The first 2 relate to a programme of work that's been going on for kind of many years, while the third is a recently completed study around adults who've had a bereavement through substance use, and this project generated a huge amount of qualitative data. So it's inevitable that I can only give you an overview to each of the areas that I'm going to be talking about. But I've agreed with Jack that I'm going to share with you some of our published papers and also a link to where you can download for free our Bereaved Through Substance Use guidelines, and this will happen after the seminar. My talk's going to be split kind of roughly into 2 main halves, and so I will leave time in the middle to see if there's any kind of questions that you have, and to just take a bit of a breather. And kind of finally, particularly with regards to the bereavement study, I'll be sharing some quotes from our interviewees, and some of you may find some of these quotes upsetting. So this is just a warning from me about that. Please do look after yourself if you find any of what I'm going to say upsetting. Just before I start, it's really important for me to say that all of what I'm going to be talking about is work that I've done as a team, and so this slide acknowledges just some, but not all, of my main colleagues over the years, and I'm sure that some of the names on this slide will be familiar to some of you. Okay. So in terms of the first area that I'm going to be talking about, why is it important that we think about and try to support family members affected by loved ones' substance use? I think there are a number of answers to that. First, historically, it's been the case that theoretically family members have tended to be viewed in a very dysfunctional way. So they've often been seen to be kind of blamed for the person's substance use, or for the substance use to be the result of pathological or dysfunctional families or codependent relationships. And I think this is also borne out in the fact that there's historically also been failures to offer enough support to affected family members and to find out what their experience is and their needs are. There are more interventions and services out there where family members are engaged with the primary aim of getting the person with the drug or alcohol use into treatment and to keeping them there, rather than to offering help to family members in their own right. And that's certainly a gap that our work has been trying to fill. So we overall think that family members are a group which is poorly understood, kind of marginalised, isolated and lacking in support, and that more research is needed to understand their experiences and needs, and through that influence practice and policy. And finally, I think it's the sheer scale of the problem. There are very few firm estimates out there as to how many people are affected by a loved one's substance use, but I think we really only need to consider the prevalence of drug and alcohol problems themselves, and the ripple effect that they can have in terms of impact, to get a sense as to how many people we're going to be talking about. An emerging area of work just in the last few kind of years or so is that of establishing the impact of drug and alcohol kind of problems on societies, and so there's been a number of studies with the title of Harm to Others, and these have been done in England, Wales, Ireland and Australia, and there's also been similar work in the likes of New Zealand and in Norway. And the first 2 points here on this slide just give just a couple of sample statistics from a couple of the pieces of work that have been done kind of recently here in the UK, both last year or this year. I think, and even that the samples aren't kind of massive. They're more than reasonable, and they both show that quite substantial numbers of the respondents to both of the surveys have experienced one or more harms as a result of someone else's alcohol use in both of these kind of cases in the last year. And another piece of work over in New Zealand pulled together data and evidence from a range of sources, finding that self-reported harm from others drinking was higher than harm from their own kind of use, with the study concluding, as the quote here shows, that the range and magnitude of harms from others drinking are substantial but not well described. There's another ongoing study which is involving an international kind of group of 7 low and middle income countries, along with existing research from Australia and New Zealand. And I think the point to make from all of this is this is an important kind of new area of work, although all of the studies that I've made notice to so far are focusing on alcohol only. And I think of the many contributions which this area of work can make is to try and better calculate the prevalence of those who are affected by someone else's drinking, and to make a better estimate of the financial and societal burden which such kind of problems bring. Okay, so moving on to the first area of work and our programme of work, which has been going on for over 30 years, and there's been a number of strands to it. Firstly, understanding family members' experiences, and we've done work in the UK and in a number of other countries to understand that. We've used that kind of evidence to develop our own theoretical way of describing the experience of affected family members. We've used that then to develop our own intervention, which is called the 5-step method, and then we work with services and with organisations and services in other countries as well to test and roll out and adapt the intervention, and there's a number of elements to that. And we also have versions for kind of families affected by gambling and for young people affected by parental substance use. And I'm just going to go through maybe some of the highlights from our programme of kind of work. So we've used international mixed methods research involving both quantitative and qualitative data. Early work was in the UK with Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia and kind of Mexico City, with more recent work in a number of other countries, including across Europe, South America, Asia and Africa. And the quotes here are from some of our publications that perhaps try and best summarise our work. And I think, a highlight is that it seems to be the case that kind of family members are essentially ordinary people exposed to common, everyday and often highly stressful circumstances, which for many can be likened to living, with other common adversities or to traumas, which can be extremely stressful. And I think even though we've conducted the work, in a range of cultures and a range of settings, there appears to be a core experience, although this does have some elements of nuance and of variation, perhaps according to, for example, culture, faith and the size and role of a family, what can be called a variform universal. And some of the elements of that experience are listed on the slide here. So for family members, they are often kind of dealing with the fallout from coexisting kind of issues alongside the alcohol and drugs, particularly kind of mental health, and also domestic abuse can be particularly common. There can be, like a lot of worry, relationships and family life can suffer greatly. There's a huge amount of strain which can manifest itself in a range of ways. Family members can experience a huge range of negative emotions, and they can quite often be under the belief that the only way that things are going to change, the only solution is for their relative to reduce or to stop their kind of use of alcohol and or drugs, so they don't think that they can get help for themselves. So they struggle on, and they're often kind of isolated, and they don't know how and where to get kind of help, or also that they're deserving of help. Now, while we've done less work ourselves about the impact of these problems on children, there's a huge amount of work out there in the UK and elsewhere that's kind of looked at the impact of kind of drug and alcohol problems, particularly in parents, on their children. And these quotes are taken from a couple of UK pieces of work. And I think it's fair to say that kind of children often experience kind of many of the same struggles and emotions as adults. And some of the main ways, some of the core experience for them is that they're going to be living with chaos, unpredictability, isolation, fear, kind of living within families that want to keep the problems a secret and being caught up in that, which impacts their talking to other people and accessing help. They can experience loss through family breakup or the bereavement, or because of absent, inconsistent or neglectful parenting. There can be an accumulation of risk for them if other problems are also there, particularly conflict and disruption. There's a risk of themselves developing substance use issues or mental health or behavioural problems. They can have problems at school. They often have to take on a caring role, maybe for a parent or a sibling, which perhaps can impede their own life. And they may also blame themselves, and in some cases they will have been told that the problems are their fault. And I think all of this can impact upon a child's development, identity and their relationships, with other people, both in and out of the family. But there's been a growing strand of research in recent kind of years, which has done a lot to show that children aren't always as affected by these problems as much as we might expect. There's been increased recognition of a set of protective factors and processes which operate at the individual, family and environmental kind of level, which can, if they're in place, support a child to become resilient, which is essentially buffering them against the negative effects of the misuse and the risk of negative outcomes. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be helping these children, quite the opposite, but it's important to be aware of this side of the work and not and just look at maybe building family and individual strengths rather than kind of having an entirely risk-focused approach. This slide on the left just lists some of the individual, family and environmental protective factors that may then contribute to the building of a child's resilience, the evidence of which can be seen with some of the examples on the right-hand column. So going back to our international work and the knowledge that we have also of how children can be affected, one of our research group's contributions to the field has been to use our work, particularly the early work in England, Mexico and Australia, and more latterly work in a number of other countries, to describe the core experience and its variation that I described above. And our theoretical model is the stress-strain coping support model, to describe that experience and where there may be similarities but also differences. In particular, our model challenges and is different from a number of other approaches out there. Firstly, through its focus on kind of family members in their own right, and secondly, through its avoidance of a number of key terms used elsewhere, such as codependence, dysfunctional, deficient, pathologizing, blame, failure, enabling, and so on, by describing the plight of family members as a highly prevalent but normal set of circumstances. Lots of other models out there can appear, for example, through the language and terms that they use to blame families. All the models out there do have their role to play, and there's always going to be people who find a particular model more or less helpful, but we believe ours has made a new contribution and so has a particular place within the wider environment. And essentially, the model, and I hope you could just about read okay, the diagram on the slide. The diagram kind of will also be in one of the papers, but will be circulated to you afterwards. So the shaded boxes are the building blocks of kind of our model, which very simply states that families experience stress as a result of someone else's drinking or kind of drug use. The resulting strain can lead to physical and psychological ill health, and that stress and strain can be mediated by a number of things: the quality and amount of information available, the methods of coping, and the level and quality of social support out there. And so, stemming from our research and the theoretical kind of model which I've just gone through, we then developed a brief intervention for family members in their own right. This is the 5-step method. It's an intervention which has been recommended by NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and in other guidance, and it's widely used here in the UK, and has also been introduced with some adaptations and sometimes translations in other countries. And I'm also involved with a programme of work in Northern Ireland, which has been developing and introducing a version of the intervention for children and young people called Steps to Cope. The key kind of principles of the intervention are that it's kind of evidence-based in 2 kind of major ways. Firstly, that it comes from our primary work asking family members about their experiences, and also in evaluation and testing as well. Other principles include the core structure, which must be followed, though there's some flexibility kind of to that, and that really use of the intervention requires training before the delivery and access to the materials. You can see the 5 steps here on the screen. And they're essentially, the first step is to take time in a non-judgmental way, and in a non-directive way as well, to listen, reassure and explore the concerns and hear the family members' experiences. Secondly, to provide them, with relevant, specific and targeted information, which is usually about alcohol and drugs, but maybe about other issues as well. For example, I don't know, kind of mental health or housing, or maybe benefits and welfare and so on. The third step is to explore how a family member copes. The fourth step is to explore their support networks. And the fifth step is an opportunity both to review the work, but also to explore further needs for the family member, perhaps by signposting or referring on elsewhere, but also seeing if there's others who may also want to engage in help, including, for example, children or the person with the substance use issue themselves. So it's, as I said, it's a person-centered intervention. It's not a directive intervention. It's about using these building blocks to have facilitated conversations with family members that can empower them and give them the space and the time to look at their experiences and their needs and to find a way forward, regardless of the circumstances of the person with the problem. We've gathered a lot of evidence over the years for how the 5-step kind of method can help family members. On this slide is just a small amount of data from a randomised controlled trial that we did in primary care a number of years ago, where we looked at the outcomes of kind of impact of the problem of health symptoms and of coping. We were able to follow up quite a large kind of number of our sample to 12 months, and the graph shows that there were reductions, which means that a family member is improving in the 3 areas over time, and those findings were supported by our qualitative data as well. Now we've moved over the years from using several long questionnaires to assess the impact of our work to streamlining our questionnaires from 5 into 1, and that's purely for the purposes of practicality when we were looking to introduce the intervention into frontline services, and kind of wanting something that would be more feasible and more kind of realistic for them to have to assess the impact of our work, that would also mean we could continue to collect kind of evidence. So we now have one questionnaire which has items from each of the questionnaires which targets a building block of the model and the intervention, so kind of covering impact, symptoms, coping and support. And the data on the next couple of graphs are from a sample of before and after data from about 100 family members, kind of gathered from a piece of work with the National Problem Gambling Clinic in London. And you can see that there are significant changes from baseline to follow up, like in nearly all of the variables, which is meaning that a family member has improved over time. So on this slide, improvement in the impact of the problem and the 2 components of that, a reduction in symptoms, so an improvement in physical and psychological health, and a shift in how a family member copes. And you would expect to see that maybe family members are engaging in less of some forms of the response, but we would expect perhaps an increase in the withdrawal form of coping, which is about maybe thinking for themselves and seeking some independence from the problem as well. And this final slide on that shows that particularly the third set of bars along are that the family members felt that they'd had an improvement in helpful formal support, which is going to be largely the support that they received from, the gambling clinic, and a reduction in overall family burden as well. And just to add some qualitative and visual data to the mix, there's some quotes on this slide from some family members that we've interviewed over the years, and I think these, together show the importance of an intervention which is family members in their own right. And I mentioned as well that we've introduced a young person's version of the 5-step method into Northern Ireland, and with the pilot work that we did a few years ago, I did a kind of draw or write exercise with young people as part of interviews to find out what they thought of the intervention. There's just a couple of nice examples here, I think. This one, the young person did this with her worker, actually, and the picture on the left is how she felt things were for her before she started the intervention, so dark and gloomy, perhaps not as happy, whereas on the right is how she felt things were for her after she'd gone through the intervention. So a change in colour, perhaps a change in facial expression, perhaps overall a brighter outlook. Another girl I spoke to had the same feelings as me, that her kind of drawing wasn't going to be up to scratch, so she chose to write what she thought, and the font colours, which I hope you can see, purple on the left and red on the right, do reflect the colour of pen that the young person chose to use. So you'll see that, before the intervention, the young girl was really getting very upset. She wasn't really talking about what was going on for her, whereas through the work, she's become more kind of open, knowing that she has to trust people, and that she's finding it easier to talk about her, her kind of problems, and finds that this has overall had a very positive impact on her, and says that a large, she feels that the booklet, so the Steps to Cope intervention, has played a big part in improving things for her. So just to bring this half of things, this first half of the seminar to a close, where are we at with the 5-step intervention now? We think it's still a pretty rare, evidence-based form of support for family members in their own right. It does seem to be the case that it's important to follow the steps in the order in which they're kind of given, though there can be flexibility in the delivery, including its use in different settings by a range of practitioner groups, the length, frequency, and so on of the sessions can be, another form of flexibility, as well. Can also be delivered with groups of family members on the phone by using a self-help book. So there's a lot of flexibility there, but it's important to follow the steps in order and keep to that core structure. And also, as I said, we've been introducing adapted versions of the intervention as well. So that brings the first half of the seminar to an end. I hope it's been okay and you've been able to follow it kind of okay. I literally have no idea sitting here if it's kind of going okay. Perhaps I'll just take a few seconds now just to take a deep kind of breath and have some water and see if there's any questions, Jack, before I move on to the second half.
Thanks very much for that, Lorna. That was all really interesting. It's really interesting to hear about the 5-step method and how it's sort of developing. And we had a couple of questions to you about, it's really interesting to hear about the young person's version through the Steps to Cope. And
Yep.
Is this just something that, is the Steps to Cope something that's been developed in Northern Ireland. Is there sort of plans to develop this further in other sort of locations overseas?
Yes, we certainly hope so. I think we did 2 small pilot pieces of work over in Northern Ireland, which then allowed us to get a grant from the big lottery to develop the work, that kind of program of work kind of further and gather more kind of evidence. And I think because it was very new, I think we just wanted to be very kind of cautious before we rolled it out on a bigger, you know, scale, really, to check that, you know, the evidence was there and the intervention that had been initially developed for the adult world could be also applied for children and young people. But yes, we certainly hope. I mean, one of the parts of the Northern Ireland work has been to develop a website and an online version of the intervention. So it's kind of possible that, you know, the website and that side of things will be able to be much more widely available. And we hope that we could look for opportunities to take the work kind of with young people elsewhere as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. It'd be very interesting to see how it does develop in future. And I've also had another question asking about in the sort of opening of the webinar, you were talking about how the experiences of people where their family member is perhaps misusing substances or alcohol. It's interesting to say that you found that these experiences are fairly similar. And did you notice sort of cultural differences across the world where you've done different bits of sort of global research?
I think, yeah, there are some, and I didn't have time to go through that in too much detail. There'll certainly be a bit more insight into some of the papers that I'll be sending around, and we've got a book as well, and I've kind of given like a reference and things to that, like in a reference list on the final slide. But I think there are, like, I mean, obviously perhaps the role of kind of faith and the religion and things that was maybe particularly strong in the likes of Mexico and Italy. Perhaps the size of the family and the fact that maybe families are much kind of larger and living in much closer proximity to each other. Again, perhaps in Mexico City, Aboriginal societies are very community and family oriented, large extended families and communities and things. I think all of those things can perhaps kind of impact on both help seeking and talking about it, but also how people can be affected. So those are maybe just I think that I wasn't involved. I think some of the has been work in Italy, where I think they conducted work in a number of kind of regions of Italy, and they did show there's maybe some kind of gender and geographical kind of changes, for example, perhaps in how family members cope. So there are certainly kind of nuances and subtleties out there around what appears to be a core experience.
Oh, that's really interesting, and it's great to hear about the research, and I think that's a really great answer for everyone who's listening in. I think there's quite a lot of interest in sort of how these things do differ globally, but as you say, there are these sort of underlying things that are the same, which are throughout the experience, which is really interesting to hear. But I think that's it for the questions that we've got for now. So I'll hand back over to you if you're ready, or if you want to take a bit more of a break.
Yeah, no, I'm fine to carry on. Has the sound been okay? I got a notification that there's maybe a connection issue, like at one point, but has everything been okay?
It's been very clear for at my end, so yeah.
Okay, good,
okay. Yeah.
good.
Oh, thanks so much.
Just best to check I'm not just sitting here talking to myself.
No, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, I will carry on.
Fantastic.
Okay. So the second half, I'm going to be focusing on supporting adults bereaved by an alcohol or drug-related death. And again, why is this important? I think the answers to this are actually very similar to the answers I gave to the same question for the first half of my talk, but even more so when we embarked on this piece of work, when we got the idea, there's been an almost total lack of UK or international research in this area. It was quite staggering when we tried to do a search to see what else was out there, to find how little there in fact kind of there's been. I think one of the other reasons why this topic's important is that the work that has been done appeared to suggest that maybe this was a special death. There are perhaps some similarities with maybe a death through suicide or through murder, and maybe some of the particular features of those deaths were the circumstances of the death themselves, the stigma that was attached to them, and hence to those who died and those who were left behind, and what's called which is called disenfranchised grief. And so again, this is a group which was poorly understood, marginalised, isolated, and lacking in support, and where there was much, a great need for more work to understand experiences and needs. And again, there's no estimates of how many people are affected by these deaths, but particularly in the UK, we only have to look to the mortality stats around alcohol and kind of other drugs to again get a sense as to how many people are going to be affected. Now, this particular study came about in quite an interesting way, even though we'd all been working in this field for a number of years, and maybe death and things had come up in directly. We hadn't focused on it until I met, through a colleague down here, I met a lady called Joan who talked about the death of her son from a drugs overdose, and how she found it so hard to get any support for her and her family that she set up her own organisation, which is called Bereavement Through Addiction. It's based down here in the city, and I was very taken with what Joan said, saw the opportunities perhaps to open up another area of work. We formed a partnership with colleagues in Scotland and with the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath, and got the research funding for the piece of work that I'm going to be talking about. Joan was a core kind of member of our team. She unfortunately very sadly died about 18 months ago, so she wasn't able to see the end of our piece of work, though we've kind of dedicated some of our main outputs to her, and we're continuing to try to get further funding for the work to kind of keep her legacy going. So the study was a 3-year piece of work which was finished last year. It was undertaken in Scotland and the southwest of England. We did 100 interviews with 106 adults who'd experienced a bereavement through substance use, 6 focus groups with 40 practitioners, and then we convened a working group who developed our practice kind of guidelines. And it's going to be the kind of interviews and the guidelines which are going to be the main things that I'm going to be talking about now. So in terms of the interviewees, we did have mainly women in our sample, but we had perhaps a more, I think it's historically been, the case in substance use work that it tends to be maybe parents, kind of children and partners who take part. So even though that was largely the case in this piece of work, we were still kind of really pleased to attract, some other categories of family member and friend as well. We also worked with some local treatment services and were able to include like a number of people who were themselves in treatment or recovery from a substance use kind of issue. There's a very wide range for the interviewees as how long it had been since the death of their relative or friend, and the the people who had died, who they talked about in the interviews, were kind of mainly male, and they were mainly white as well. So I'm going to be going through, giving you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the main findings from our piece of work. It's inevitably a snapshot only. You know, the interviews kind of average maybe 60 to 90 minutes. We had 100 of them. So there's a huge amount of data. And there's also, you know, again, perhaps a core experience, but it's been really interesting to explore, you know, again, you know, the diversity, first between England and Scotland, the relationship of interviewee to the deceased, kind of differences between alcohol and drug deaths, and interviewees who are themselves in treatment, or, you know, and the impact on children. And I am going to be giving a bit more insight and perhaps some of those kind of differences a little later. So what became clear from the interviews was that the kind of impact of what had been going on before the death was, you know, incredibly important, and the circumstances before death could continue to play out and have an impact after death. It was more often the case that the substance use was problematic and had been ongoing for some time and affected interviewees, including the relationships with the deceased and the wider family. In terms of the person who subsequently died, there was variation in terms of their engagement with services. Actually, many weren't engaged with services when they died. Some had recently lapsed, but this was sometimes not known to our interviewees. And for some, there was also the presence of other kind of issues which they've been kind of grappling with, maybe mental health issues, and their battles to try to get kind of help. Some had also, most unfortunately, experienced or even been kind of witness to kind of previous overdose and suicide attempts of their kind of loved one, and some were involved in the resuscitation attempts kind of afterwards. And I think that meant that for a number of our interviewees, they've been living maybe with the possibility of death, often for quite some time. Some felt that the person maybe that they knew or you know, they loved had in some ways almost died, even though they were still alive. They felt that they'd lost that kind of that person, and they talked about a living bereavement. So there was a lot kind of going on before, you know, the death. There was a lot that maybe kind of mirrors what I was saying, what I was summarising in the first half of, you know, of my talk, and it's been important and really powerful to see how that impact before death could continue to affect our interviewees after the death itself. Now, pretty much all of the deaths had an element of some kind of trauma to them. So the deaths included overdoses, serious illnesses, accidents, including 2 RTAs, which I am going to say a little bit more about, suicide and murder. A couple, maybe 2 or 3, occurred abroad, which brought further stress and complexity for interviewees. We had more unexpected and sudden which were more likely to be associated with drugs, whereas the alcohol deaths were more likely to be perhaps slightly more like expected due to long-term health issues associated with their years of drinking. Unfortunately and tragically, kind of many of the deceased, you know, they died alone or in a public place, or they were found at home, perhaps often with unsuccessful accounts of attempts to resuscitate the person. And I think there's overall a very sad sense that these are deaths which often occurred without kind of privacy, dignity, or peace. The nature of the circumstances of the death also meant that many of our interviewees were caught up with official processes which could just complicate things and add to their stress at an already very difficult time. So many of our interviewees were informed of the death by the police, and unfortunately in many cases this was just not kind of done well. Just to go back to the quote that's in the bottom of this slide here, with someone being told in front of other people. There were other cases of people, perhaps the person's name being got wrong, or being told, but then the police just, essentially, leaving them alone, leaving them high or dry with no follow-up or anything. There were a large number of investigations by the police, post-mortems and inquests. Often these were drawn out. Some of the inquests took place over a year after the death itself occurred. And so overall, many of our interviewees found all of this complicated, confusing, and almost entirely bereft of any thought of them, who felt poorly informed and lacking in support. And there were also, for some, particularly where there was drug use, limits to viewing or being able to touch, the loved one, and how the deceased was handled. Stigma was one of the most dominant themes in our data sets. This could be in a direct way, that's from like the first quote here, or indirect or perceived stigma, as the quote from the mother on the slide shows. Stigma could also come from all areas, including other family members, friends, colleagues, the community, as well as from the media, and a range of services and practitioners and professionals kind of out there. Obviously, stigma could have a major impact on grief, seeking support, how the deceased was remembered, and acknowledging or talking with others about the true kind of nature of the death. So yes, experiences of stigma were very common, could have an impact on being able to receive or ask for help, and in some cases would prevent the family member acknowledging the role of substances in the death, or perhaps an interviewee wanted to be very open about it, but was in conflict maybe with others in the family, who felt ashamed and embarrassed and didn't want the true cause of the death to be known. Many of our interviewees did find, I think, very strong, resilient and creative ways to try to respond to stigma, for example, in what they said in their eulogy, or by trying to work with a newspaper kind of editor. Mixed degrees of success there. And there were a number of other examples as well. So you won't be surprised from what I've been saying so far that the grieving of our interviewees was extremely kind of difficult for them, particularly often given the circumstances and fallout from the kind of death. The way they reacted emotionally could be very kind of complex. So, for example, some maybe where they'd been, suffering from the impact of, the substance use for many, many years, did end up feeling some sort of like a relief, either for them or through their loved one being now at peace. But some then felt a huge amount of maybe anger or kind of guilt for the relief that they were feeling. Some have shown again remarkable strength and resilience in trying to cope with the death, and maybe ensure that something positive was to come from it. So some have written books, made films, written poetry, raised money for relevant charities, perhaps kind of maybe volunteered or trained to work in the field. I guess the impact and stigma and grief and things could also have an impact on how their loved one was going to be remembered after their death. Actually, kind of many didn't want the deceased to be, what I've said here, defined by their addiction. This was hard for some because of perhaps what they'd experienced while their loved one, was alive, or perhaps where there was conflict with others. But some kind of, really wanted their kind of loved one to be seen as a whole person rather than an addict, and they wanted others to know that too. I'm just going to go on now to look at some of the subgroups in our sample, and I'm going to go through 3, and then I'll move on to introduce our guidelines to you. So firstly, with 21 adult children in our sample, we also had quite a lot of interviewees also talking about the impact of death on children and grandchildren, even though the death wasn't always that of a parent, it could be an older sibling. So in terms of the adult children, the sample of 21, some were under 18 when their parent died, and the majority of this group of deaths involved alcohol, and often the child had been living with the alcohol use of their parent for almost all of their lives when they died. A small kind of number were in treatment and so on at the time of interview, and I think what they talked about in terms of how they're affected by their parents' use very much like aligns with the literature and the work that I went through earlier. Particular in terms of the death, the children, these adult children often talked about the loss that they felt they'd experienced before kind of death and when death came itself. So the loss of a parent and the regret that they were unable to help them, and the loss of hope, the fact that they were never going to get their parent back, they were never going to have that, what they described as a normal parent-child relationship. And for some, perhaps the combinations of relief and guilt. I should have said before I started this section of my talk that I've taken the decision not to read the quotes out to you. I hope I'm giving enough time for you to read the quotes as we're going through. I am more than happy for my slides to be shared with you all afterwards, and one of the papers that I'll be asking Jack to send around afterwards is our core findings paper from this kind of piece of work, and there's quotes kind of in there for you to kind of read more in your own time as well. So going back, children, the adult kind of children talked about the fact they've got support mainly from families and friends, rarely from professionals, including schools for those who were younger when the death occurred. They found a range of ways to try to deal with their grief. Some just wanted to carry on as normal, for example, with their education or their employment. Kind of for others, it may be kind of was the start of or an escalation in their own use of substances. This group also struggled to understand and make sense of, the death. There was mixed involvement with official processes. For some, again, particularly, the younger ones, they may be excluded from key, decisions, or maybe still didn't have an awareness about whether there was a post-mortem or what an inquest said, because they were excluded from that, or maybe excluded from, decisions perhaps as viewing the deceased, or decisions around the funeral. And for this group, particularly because they'd often experienced really difficult childhood, kind of growing up with the substance use, how they remembered their parents could be really difficult. So the second group is those who are in treatment or recovery because of their own substance use. Again, this is about a fifth of our sample, quite a kind of range in terms of how they were related to the person who died. Some of this group had a history of substance use with the person who later died, while as for others, their substance use was maybe associated with perhaps being affected by, for example, their parents' substance use. And so, you know, developing their own kind of problem as a response to that. This group saw a close association between their own substance use and the impact of what was sometimes unresolved grief associated wholly or partly with the death of their relative or friend, as these quotes show. This group also illustrated how grief can impede their recovery from substance use, but how where bereavement support was available as part of treatment, and it wasn't for very many at all, it could help them. And then finally, I just had a quick look. I think we've got kind of only two deaths in our sample, which were specifically road traffic accidents. So I just thought, actually, given the nature of the organisation, that I'd just give you an overview of these. Actually, they are, their stories are very different. So the first was a mother whose son crashed his car and died in hospital as the result of the brain injury that he sustained. It was found out at the inquest that his son actually was over the limit in terms of alcohol and drugs, which surprised the interviewee. Though there continued perhaps to be some uncertainty over how the crash happened, whether he hit the curb or perhaps there was an animal or like another vehicle, or kind of lights. It seems to be very unclear. And this kind of woman, and I know the quote was used in an earlier slide as well, so sorry about that. It is one of the interviewees who doesn't really want to tell other people that there are alcohol, like and drugs involved in her son's death, because she felt that it would misrepresent him and others would just see him as someone who was drunk and crashed his car rather than as a much loved son who was maybe usually very kind of careful and so on. The other story is a woman who talked about the death of her sister, who'd essentially been drinking. She was extremely drunk. She fell in the road while trying to get home. She was unconscious and she was run over by someone who didn't know that what he hit in the road was in fact a person. This particular interviewee told me that she felt a huge amount of pity towards the kind of driver and the circumstances that he found himself in, but also of anger towards the pub who continued to serve her sister and allow her to leave in the state that she did. She was also, perhaps this is interesting in terms of stigma as well, to think that she was relieved at the inquest to find that it was an accident. She'd half kind of wondered whether the circumstances around the sister meant that she'd gone into the road on purpose. One of the other things that this woman talked about was the public nature of how this death was maybe played out, needing to deal with the professionals and, kind of reading and seeing about the death on, the TV. And even though perhaps her sister wasn't actually named, knowing that it was her kind of loved one that they were talking about. So I think they're two very different stories. I've only given, a couple of highlights here to them. I can't say that they're going to be representative of all this type of death where there is an accident. But I think, you might be able to see that maybe some of the experiences of the family members, perhaps, the role of the kind of media, the stigma, some of the impacts on grief and things do align with some of the other main themes that are coming out of this piece of work. So the final section of my talk, because we wanted a main output from our study to be a set of guidelines, we focused much more on what our interviewers told us about the support that they received. They described interactions with the very wide range of professionals and organisations. Actually, you can see on this slide here, you might not be able to read all of this slide, I don't expect you to, but even just by knowing there's a lot of words there and a lot of lines, this is from pulling together interviews and focus groups, all the possible people that someone bereaved through kind of substance use may need to come in touch with on their grief journey. But our interviewees, they also talked about support from families and wider networks, including the networks of the deceased. There were very mixed experiences. Unfortunately, isolation and poor experiences of support were significantly more commonplace than good experiences. And alongside the amount of support that was available, interviewees also illustrated that how the support is delivered is important. And these quotes show a poor example here and two kind of good examples illustrating the need for empathy, sensitivity, and also humanising and personalising the deceased as well. So when we were looking to convene our working group and develop our practice guidelines, we looked a lot at the support themes in our data set, also pulled together this diagram, and we realised that we weren't going to be able to do everything, and that because there's so little out there for this group of people, that we would pull together kind of really a starting point, a set of generic guidelines that are developed by practitioners for practitioners. They're not specifically for bereaved people. There are some resources out there for this group of bereaved people. Not a lot, but there's something out there. And so kind of we felt that our focus could maybe be most kind of usefully put in this kind of area. So these are our guidelines, and they're centred on these 5 key messages. There'll be a URL circulated to you after the seminar where you can read a little bit more about this kind of piece of work, and you can download for free a PDF of our guidelines. So I suspect that you've probably all had enough of hearing my voice, and I've been talking for I'm pretty impressed with how much I've kept to time. Actually, I didn't really know how long this was going to take. So just some thoughts by way of conclusion, and then I'll hand back to Jack. So in terms of this piece of work, we feel that this is a group of bereaved people who face several complex and distressing dilemmas both before and after death, and that actually we have done a little bit of work to see how our theoretical approach that I outlined in the first half could be applied to this issue. We feel that our piece of work extends knowledge about how people can be affected by the alcohol or drug death of a relative or friend, and that the diversity of experience and need means that the response needs to be individualised. This is a group who are lacking in support both before and after death, and we hope that our study will make a contribution to like awareness and changing kind of policy and practice. Even though we weren't funded to do so, we've been trying to get examples of how the guidelines have been making a difference and having like an impact for some of our colleagues and organisations that have been kind of using them. And I think we've distributed over 2,000 hard copies of our guidelines, and hopefully the PDF has been kind of accessed a lot as well. What I will also say is that we are looking for funding to keep going with this programme of work, and actually this piece of work is also a bit of an offshoot of it. I'm involved, being led by a colleague in Manchester, big lottery funding to do a piece of work around end of life and substance use, and we're going to be using this kind of data set to also explore the end of life experiences of our interviewees, which is another huge gap. So that's all I've got to say. I really do hope that you've been able to hear me okay and follow the slides okay, and that you found something interesting and useful in what I've had to say. As I said, I'm happy for my slides to be circulated. There's a couple of URLs there where you can find out more about one of the organisations I'm involved with, and where you can access the guidelines. There's some references there. Some of these will be some of the papers that will be coming around to you after the seminar. So that's all for me, unless there are any final questions. So back to you, Jack.
Well, thank you very much, Lorna. I think on behalf of everyone, that was really, really interesting and great to hear about all the research. And I think that's probably been very beneficial to everyone in the audience today. So huge thanks for the presentation today. I have had one or two final questions, if that's okay for you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Good.
I've had a question which was through your experience. Obviously, you've had over 15 years experience of research into substance misuse, addiction and alcohol use. Have you noticed during this stage any sort of difference in public attitudes to these issues and sort of stigma and things surrounding them?
Well, that's a really interesting, tough question. I think we're getting there. I think there's certainly been a growing interest in maybe the research side of things, slightly more attention in national and local policy, though not nearly enough. I think maybe frontline services want to do more to be more family focused, but I guess in a climate of austerity and commissioning constraints and things, it's incredibly hard to do this well on top of everything else. In terms of public attitudes, I'm not sure. I think perhaps in some circles there would be different, maybe more kind of welcoming and respectful and sympathetic attitudes, but maybe in other circles less so. There may be differences, for example, perhaps where there's coexisting mental health issues, or maybe whether you're talking about alcohol or drugs. So I think it's very hard to give just one answer to. I think we're on the right road, but there's still a long way to go. And I think the fact that actually the interviews that we did for the bereavement work were done over the course of, I think it was 2013, and I think the huge amount of stigma that particularly this group of people were kind of talking about perhaps is an example that there's still a long way to go.
Sure, that definitely makes sense. And another question that we've had is that in the research that you've done, when you're talking to people who are bereaved of people through substance misuse or alcohol use, what sort of extent have you found that the people who've actually tragically passed away themselves have been in their lives traumatically or suddenly bereaved? Is that something that you find that's common?
Whether the people who died had a bereavement in their lives before they died?
Yes, yeah, that was the question, yes.
I'm not, I need to think about that. I mean, obviously our interviewees were talking more about the impact of the death on them, but I think and I think I would say some certainly had, and perhaps that was, you know, the fact that they had experienced maybe a difficult childhood or something difficult in their lives, which could include a sudden death, perhaps, and the fact that that was resolved had been a factor in their addiction, and maybe in their death, but that wasn't something that our interviewees talked quite as much about. So I'm not sure I could answer that with a great deal of accuracy. It's a very interesting question, and one that I will think over and come back to you with any other thoughts.
Oh, thanks, that's really helpful. I just had another question for you that I'm just reading. Did families report any difference in support available to them if there had been coexisting mental health issues, is the question.
Yes, significantly worse experiences. I'm sure the person who's answering that kind of question won't be surprised to hear that. I think where there were coexisting addiction and mental health issues for the person before they died, the impact on the family members was significantly greater. I think I can think of some examples where the family member, so our interviewee, had been maybe kind of battling to support their kind of loved one who subsequently died to get kind of mental health needs, and there are a couple of very particularly awful and tragic stories out there. So it can certainly, and I think, I mean, I know there's perhaps a growing agenda, maybe a growing positive agenda around, you know, being able to understand and talk about and respond to mental health in this country, but perhaps when that's overlapping with substance use, that's going to be an even tougher call for us to be able to move forward with.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. And a final question for you. If there's anyone in the audience today who's supporting people who have been bereaved by substance use or alcohol, are there any sort of organisations that you think you'd particularly recommend to them that they might be able to signpost people onto?
Yes, so I think in some cases it would depend geographically where you are. It's very much a postcode lottery, and obviously I can't speak for outside of the UK if we've anyone international in the audience. There's an organisation called Drug Fam, which is based in the High Wycombe, Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire area. It's set up by a woman called Elizabeth Burton Phillips. They do a lot of work supporting kind of families. One of Elizabeth's twin sons died about 12 years ago, and so there's a bereavement strand, including, I think, helpline support and maybe mentoring and support groups and things. So Drug Fam is a website which you can easily find using Google. Bereavement Through Addiction down here in Bristol, now attached to Bristol Drugs Project. I think there's a new support group just about to start in Swindon. I think there's another one in the northwest somewhere, but I can't remember where. And finally, there is also support in Scotland. You could go to Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs, or the organisation, the acronym is FASS, it's in Glasgow. And finally, ADFAM, which is a national organisation supporting families and crews, are coming to the end of a project where they've been developing peer support for people who've been bereaved in this way. So you could find out more about that. I think they're setting up groups in London, possibly in Birmingham. But I can certainly, I mean, you know, I can send more information around. I'm happy to be contacted after the webinar if people have other questions or want to find out more.
Oh, that's really useful, and thanks very much for that, Lorna. And I think that's the end of the questions we've got today. So thank you again to Lorna very much for speaking today. That was really interesting and a great overview. And also thanks very much to everyone for tuning in and listening, and I hope you enjoyed the event and found everything useful.
Just very, very quickly, there's a resources pages in the back of our guidelines, and a lot of what I've just said will be listed in there with some more examples as well, just to give them a final plug, but it's also an answer to the question.
That's fantastic, and I'll make sure that all those resources are passed around after this webinar.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much, Lorna.
All right then.
I'll close down.
Thank you very much, everyone.